this is more of a philosophical question, is why is it so hard for us to maybe sometimes even just by ourselves get to a point where we can communicate those words
Mm,
outwardly? So we actually recognize maybe the beliefs that we're believing. I don't know if this relates, but there's been lots of times where I have a negative thought about myself, but then I'll say it out loud and I'm like, I can't believe I think that about myself. That was my
yeah,
first question. And then maybe a follow-up to that is, and then how do you help people process through those negative beliefs that they have about themselves?
sure. Well, I mean, there can be all kinds of things, but I find for most of my clients, there's often like an underlying fear. Like our fear of rejection or fear of not belonging is like as basic as they come. We're
Right.
all afraid of that. One psychologist that I actually really love is an old guy. His name was Alfred Adler. And he actually interpreted all kind of psychological maladaptations as coming out of that feeling like we need to feel like we belong. He had a
Mm.
great German word called Gemeinschaftsgefühl, which was that feeling of like social belonging. And he thought it all came from that. And the struggles that we feel being like inferior is a impetus for us to push forward into that. So I think a lot of it comes out of that. It's just, do I actually belong or am I alone? And so some of our thoughts can come out of that. I mean, obviously there's a bunch of other reasons that could come from that, but that I see as a pretty big one. And there's lots of
And how do
different
you
approach.
help?
What's
Yeah,
that?
how do you help people maybe recognize and then work through those fears, maladaptive, maybe
Yeah.
irrational fears that they may be struggling with?
Yeah. So there's lots of different therapeutic interventions I might use with a client. I use this sort of like a foundation though, something called a client-centered approach, or it'd be a humanistic approach, person-centered. It's all the same thing. And basically that the idea there is that I just communicate empathy to you, that I want to feel as you feel, let you know you're not alone
Mm.
in that. And I
Mm.
pair that with something called unconditional positive regard that comes from another awesome psychologist called Carl Rogers. And it's I don't I, my position towards you doesn't change regardless of anything you say or do. It's no condition, positive regard to you. And with that as a framework, then we can use other different interventions. So we could use something called cognitive behavioral therapy, where you try and identify kind of an automatic thought and then how your mind is maybe distorting that in some unhelpful way and challenge that with some alternative thoughts. Or we could use maybe an emotion focused therapy where we try and understand what's the purpose behind your emotions that's driving some of those thoughts. Or occasionally we use a narrative therapy where we try and understand what sort of storyline you're kind of telling yourself and who the different characters are and what some alternative storylines could be. And that's been quite helpful for people. And recently, I've been trying to acquire skills for something called internal family systems that identifies kind of different parts within us that each have different roles and what each of those are. That's there's a few of those. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.